Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Lewisboro Library's presentation of Browsing Through History, the story of our library. Just to get some housekeeping issues out of the way, I would recommend the best way to view this presentation is to watch it in speaker view rather than gallery view. In addition, at the end, we will be doing a Q&A session so people can either unmute during the Q&A to ask questions or type your questions into the chat for Maureen to answer at the end. We are so happy to have Town Historian Maureen Koehl with us today to lead this program. No one knows more about the library than Maureen. Not only has she been a library patron since 1967, but she's been a library volunteer since that time, also serving on the Library Board of Trustees for 4 years. In addition, she's been heavily involved in the library fair since she moved here and ran a successful folk concert series at the library for many years. So who better to take us through this journey than Maureen? Take it away, Maureen.
Is excellent.
Thank you, Liz. And I think I heard you say I'd been a trustee for 4 years. I think it's more like 40 years. It's been a long time. It's president a couple of times, secretary a couple of times, and many, many years. My fondest memories. I'm just a library lover, I guess. And before we get into the history, I just want to thank Liz Gabriel for all her help setting up these programs, and for Cindy and Kathy Iglesias, who helped me with access to the library archives while I was trying to glean as much information as I could about the library. And I want to thank them for all their help. Also, I have to thank the spirit of Lee Blum, who passed away a couple of years ago, but it was Lee Blum who was my neighbor in Lake Wacabuck when we first moved to town in 1966, who took the new neighbors under her wing and said, "You've got to help out at the library fair." And I believe that was probably the fall of 1966 or 67. I made patent mice for the country fair, which my own cat decided to sample before we got them to the fair. But it was Lee Blum who turned me on to the library fair. So I have to blame her for all those years of being a volunteer at the fair. I have kind of divided this program into several different eras or different parts. The first is the beginning, which is 1798 until the late 1850s, just before the Civil War. And then the rebirth, which was after the Civil War, 1897 to 1903. And following that, and 1903 following, until the second rebirth of the library, which was in 1945 to 1963. And then another section will be a home of its own, 1963 to 2015. And that brings us to 2021. So I hope I can remember that that's what I wanted to do. I've got notes next to me, which I hope I remember to follow. However, here's another, there are going to be a couple of asides. One is going to be about sword, the Keeler sword. And then there'll be a quick aside about library fairs. And then another quick sidebar about the sculpture, the sun trap. So we'll be kind of taking a little journey to the side and then coming back to the library proper. While I was looking for information, looking through my archive folders from my office, I came across a newspaper article from 1982 that talked about the Keeler sword. The Keeler sword supposedly belonged, well, the original Keeler sword belonged to Jeremiah Keeler, who was in the Battle of Yorktown, and at the victories, the end of the Revolutionary War. And General Lafayette had the what he would do would be give souvenir swords to people that he especially appreciated. And one of these swords came to Jeremiah Keeler. This is the Jeremiah Keeler sword. And he supposedly walked home from Virginia using this sword as a walking stick. That Keeler sword disappeared for a while. Then it reappeared at the Keeler Tavern in Ridgefield. It went from there to the Ridgefield Library. And one day, a Keeler relative, showed up back in probably the 60s and took the sword. The sword disappeared and hasn't been seen again in Ridgefield. Then in 1982, a sword appeared at the library. It came in a long, skinny box. It came from Florida, and it came with a note. Nancy Jackson was, no, yeah, Nancy, I believe it was Nancy Jackson at the time, who opened the box and saw the sword, found a letter. The letter has since disappeared, but this article in the newspaper did talk about what was in the letter, and the letter says that this is a sword that belonged to Robert Fancher, and the sword was given to him by Lafayette. And since Robert Fancher had a history in the town of Lewisboro, the family was sending the sword back to the library to be kept safely because they felt the Fancher sword belonged in the town of the Fancher family. So for all those years that some of us have been trying to figure out why this Keeler sword doesn't look like the other Keeler sword that is in this picture, we now can probably rest assured that it's not the Keeler sword, it's the Fancher sword. So I don't know if Jay Lucy is around or on this program, but if he is, that one's for you, Jay. Now we can start looking in another direction. Well, here is one of the early, and it's the earliest record that we have of the library. This record book, the library was formed by a number of maybe 4 or 5 very interested and prominent citizens in the town, including the Boughtons, the Keelers, the Websters, the Gilberts, the Hoyts, perhaps. They started a library. They got together and they made plans for a library in 1798. By 1799, they were fairly well organized, and and books did start to circulate that early. The first librarian was Aaron Keeler. By 1804, they were organized enough to ask the state for an incorporation and a charter. So that was done. The early librarians were Webster, Gilbert, and as I said, Aaron Keeler, the first one. The books, such as they were, and they probably were less than 100 at that point, were kept in the librarian's home. And by necessity, most of the librarians lived right around downtown Salem, as it was then. It wasn't South Salem, it was Salem. And the books were kept in the librarian's home. The library the Library Association met quarterly, 4 times a year. It was the first Tuesday of June, of March, of June, of November, of September, and then December. So it met quarterly. And at that point, those quarterly, the first Tuesday of those months, you could bring your books back. You could take them out. And at first I thought you could just take out one book at a time. But in looking at this page for the accounts of the Salem Library, and this was for the year 1807, the book was too big to all fit on one screen. So you'll have to take my word for it that it's 1807. This shows over here are the names there were 43 members of this library. It wasn't public library as such. It was a subscription library. You had to pay 50 cents a year to belong to the library. Then you could come the first Tuesday of June, September, December, and March. And on those days, you would bring your books back. Now, it looks like, at first I thought you could only take out one book at a time, but obviously that's not right. You could, but you had to bring them back on the first Tuesday of those months. Um, Interesting to note, most of them are men, but there were two ladies. There's a Mary Holly, and these people are not just Salem, as we know South Salem, the village today. They were from all parts of town, because down here, interesting to note, is Margaret Lewis. Now, Margaret Lewis came to each of the meetings, but it doesn't look like Margaret took out too many books. Margaret Lewis was our namesake John Lewis's mother, and she lived in Vista. Obviously, I don't know for what reason she didn't take out too many books, although she did die a couple of years later. So maybe she just wanted to be part of the library, but didn't really have a way of getting to the library to get her books or something. I noticed Stephen Gilbert came to every meeting, and it doesn't look like he took out too many books either, but actually he was the librarian at this time in during this era. Here's another page from that book. And this page is from March of 1826, or actually it says June 1826. So it was the June meeting. And if you had time to read all of these pages, and it goes for about 30 years, they're quite interesting. And I'm just going to read a couple. On June 6, 1826, Martin Grumman did not return his book until 8 o'clock in the evening. For some reason, Merlin just wasn't on time with his book. Stephen Hoyt returned his book, but some of Jacob Hull returned the next day afternoon. So it was not only did you have to get your books in, they made a point of when your book was returned. There were fines, but I'm not exactly sure how they work, because if you only could return your books 4 times a year, I think the fines were for damaged books, because apparently there are some notes that some books came back greasy. Well, what do you expect in that era when you were probably reading by the fireplace? This is a history book written in 1916 by Joseph Webster. Joseph Webster's father was a librarian at one point, and I believe that Joseph, his son, was also a librarian at one point. And he mentions having the books in his house at the top of the stairs. That got me thinking, it's a good thing the librarians at this time all lived around the village, because you would have to move the books every time there was a new librarian. You'd have to move the books to the new librarian's house. So most of the librarians lived within not too far distance from the other. This is the cover of one of those books, and this is a cover from, I believe, 1804. Books of Salem Library to be returned the first Tuesday in March, June, September, and December. This book was number 126. So in the first 5 years of that new library, by 1804, they had slightly over 100 books. Here are some catalogs, some early catalogs. This is the earliest catalog that we know of, and it's from 1838. There are about 475 books listed in this catalog. These other catalogs are 1902 and 1908. In 1908, there were probably over 1,000 books. But in this first book, first catalog, there were 475. A quarter of them were religious books. Just for fun, here's what the inside of that 1838 catalog looked like. I just picked one page, and it happens to be, they're all listed alphabetical. So this is the H to the L's. But interesting titles. there's a classic, the Iliad. The history of popery. Now that at that time, Catholics weren't too well thought of. So, and here we have Freemasonry. There were a lot of biographies, it looks like. I know we're only in the L's, but there were a lot of lives of different people. I'm sure not too many of those lives are known. There's another Last of the Mohegans. So that's what you could take out if you belonged to the library in 1838. Now, the library did quite well until the Civil War, and then the membership kind of petered out, and there was not enough members paying dues, members coming to take out library books. So the library kind of fell by the wayside during the Civil War time. And it was maybe because the men were away fighting in the war. It also was a time when newspapers were becoming more popular. And so people were reading newspapers and maybe not worrying about going to the library. Even though sometimes we like to say the library was in continual operation from 1798 or 1999 all the way to the present, and one of the oldest libraries in New York State, we do have that going for us. But I think we have to say we took a little coffee break during the Civil War time and didn't really come back until 1897. And this is the first record book of 1897. And I just thought I'd like to read the first page of this book. And it was at their quarterly meeting on September 9th of 1897. A meeting of the residents of South Salem and vicinity was held at the residence of T.L. Van Norden on September 9th, 1897 in the evening to organize a library association. The meeting was called to order by Reverend Van Norden. Mr. Van Norden was chosen chairman and J.A. Webster, the clerk. The chairman stated the object of the meeting. After general discussion, members were called for and 46 joined with the understanding that the membership fee should be 50 cents per year, payable annually. A constitution and bylaws were then adopted. So that was 1897. And the library basically for several years until 1903 subsisted on the 50 cents a year membership by those 43 members, and whatever donations might have come their way. Now, most of the people involved with this were fairly prominent citizens, one of them being Theodore Van Norden, who went on to organize and build or develop Truesdale Lake. He owned the Horse and Hound, and that became a restaurant at that time. He lived on Boughton Road in a beautiful house, just, well, about a quarter mile from the school. But somehow good fortune came the library's way in the donation of $5,000 from this gentleman, Cyrus J. Lawrence, who grew up in South Salem, but went away to New York City to earn his fortune. But he never again lived in South Salem, but he did give $5,000, mainly in bonds, the interest of which was to be used to support the library. And with Cyrus's donation, and actually Cyrus's portrait, hopefully someday will go back on the wall. It was damaged in the move, getting ready for the new renovation. So Cyrus is living in the workroom right now, but we hope we get him back on the wall at some point. With Cyrus's money, the library was able to move the books from the latest librarian before that, and the South Salem Presbyterian Church offered them room in the meeting house. You can see the church behind the meeting house. The meeting house sat at the bottom of the, well, it would have been on the north side of the driveway up to the cemetery. And it sat there for, after the library took it over from 1903 to about 1906-07, the first decade of the 1900s. And then it was moved across the street to what we now know as the Russell Antique Shop. And this is a picture from 1945. Now, it was several decades after it was moved across the street. You can see Size Market here, and you can see all of this growth. But this is where the library lived in this building from 1903 to 1962, 63. All right, here we have the building in 1945. This is what it looked like on the inside. This is a photograph from inside that building in 1945. The librarians were all volunteer. The library wasn't open every day of the week, but it was open 2 or 3 days a week for a couple of hours on these days. And it had children's books as well as grown-up books, as adult books. The librarians, as I said, were not paid until, I believe, the first salaried librarian was Marilyn Cressy, and she received $100 for her yearly stipend. And she served as librarian until about 1962. So that was the inside. Now we're going to go 10 years later. Here's the outside of that building. All the shrubs and all the greenery is gone, and the volunteers are very busy giving the library a coat of paint. And this is 1955. And actually, I got to thinking the 2 librarians early on, Marilyn Cressy, who was librarian in this library until Lois Keeler, who was her successor, took over. Both those ladies lived within almost throwing a softball from the library. Lois Keeler lived in Happy Home, where Gary Page lives now. And I believe Marilyn Cressy lived where the Caspers live nowadays. Marilyn left the librarianship to move next door to the townhouse and was the assistant town clerk. All right, here we are. 19's a little small down there in the meeting house, and so they mounted a campaign to fund a new library. And this is Livingston Elder, who was a Wakawak architect. This is his rendering of what he hoped the new library would be. This is from the Patent Trader or some newspaper from April of 1960. Livingston Elder envisioned the area as like a town green, the center of the library, of the village. Here's the townhouse. Here's where he planned the library to be. Now, and I always wondered why we just didn't do this, but he has a circular driveway with some parking out here. Of course, nowadays we need more parking, but the post office it was being built about the same time. George Huffmeyer bought this property from the town, and with the understanding that he would build a post office and then give or sell at a nominal cost the rest of the property to the library so that they could build their new building. And that is indeed what happened. I kind of like the idea of this garden out behind the library. Livingston Elder, in wanting to keep the townhouse, the post office, and the library of a theme, looked at the Victorian elements of the townhouse, the former Keeler home. Whoops, we'll go back. And he thought that what he could incorporate into the library were the coins, the ornamentation on the corners of the townhouse. And so he designed them to be at the corners of the new library. He also liked the floor to ceiling, the Victorian era windows. So that's how he designed the library, and the front door, obviously, right here. So keep that in mind, and we'll see a couple of slides later how that played out. Here is Louise Boughton and her brother Les. And Louise and Les were great-great-grandchildren or great-great-great-grandchildren of Aaron Keeler, who was the first librarian back in 1799. So Louise and Les got to take the first shovelfuls of dirt to build that new 1960s era library. Here's what it looked like before the library was built. This is the brand new highway garage back here, which was built in the early, well, about 1960. Before that, it happened to be housed in a Quonset hut next door to where I live. So I'm ever grateful that it was moved away from my garden downtown. Of course, we didn't live here then. We didn't live here until about 6 or 7, about 9 years later. But so you can orient yourself. Here is our beloved highway garage. And here is the field that will soon become the new library. Somehow the Victorian windows disappeared from the south side, but they do remain, they remained over there. Here is librarian Lois Keeler. Here is Cyrus Russell, who was superintendent at the time. I don't know these ladies, this lady and gentleman in the back. This was Fritzie Ridgren, who happened to be president of the library board at that time. And I think this was the Presbyterian minister, Paul Young, and I'm not sure. He's one of, I think this is Paul, and I don't know who this is, but it might even be Paul. But here we have two men of the cloth. And that was in April 1963. Here's the front door of the day of the dedication. That picture became the frontispiece for in all the books at the library owned. It became the ID card for the library. And I just happened this is a watercolor by Frank Soltez, who was a commercial artist and lived over on Lake Oskalita. Some people might remember his son, Ken Soltez. And I love this watercolor that has come back to the library as a gift from, I guess, the Soltez family. I also like these blue streaks. I happened to take it when the sun was shining. It's hanging on the wall of the conference room. And I didn't realize when I took the photograph that light was coming through the blinds, but it kind of makes the library a little special. This is what the inside of the library looked in 1963. Here's the front door. This was the basic reading room. And you would just walk right through here, and we'll see the other part of the library in a little bit. But this became, here's looking out toward the townhouse. And this later on became the reference area. And over here, the mysteries. This is a little later picture of that same area, and this is in color, so you can see, as Liz said when we were looking over this the other day, those ugly green shelves that the library had, which are now in my office holding my collection of 20 years of ledgers. But this was what the library looked if you had come probably in the 1970s. This was all reference, and then on the other side of this started the mysteries. Now, an interesting thing that probably a lot of people don't remember or don't know about. This was the library extension in Goldensburg. This lasted from 1964 to 1969. And this is, most of you familiar with any recent history, this was the community house in Goldensburg, which was Park and Rec before Park and Rec moved over to Onatru. So this is the main floor of the community house, and it was the Goldensburg Extension for 5 years. The librarians each took a turn each had a daily, they served for 1 day of volunteer time. Nobody was paid. And if there were any librarians in the evening, either here or in downtown South Salem, when they did have evening hours, it wouldn't be women, it would be men librarians. The men librarians did the night shift. I'm sorry for this picture, but it's the only one I could find. This is Beth Walker, who became the librarian in 1966. She followed a succession of librarians after Lois left in 1964. There were several librarians who didn't last very long, and then Beth became our new library director. So she was the librarian and the director, and was pretty much, everybody else was pretty much volunteer. This happens to be a picture of Beth when they're getting ready for the library fair. But I needed a picture of Beth, and so that was the only one I could find. Now we're going to segue to a little sidebar. And this was the first library fair. This is going to be our library fair segment. This took place, as you can see, on that vacant lot that I showed you several slides ago. And this was 1961, September of 1961. These are the two ladies that led the fair, and Elaine Velacos told me one of these ladies is her mom. So later on for questions and answers, Elaine can remind me which one was her mom. I'm picking this one, but I don't know for sure. Anyway, the library fair was a day-long entertainment. Started out with the games and all sorts of fun things to do. And then at night, it was time for good things to eat. And I just had to include this because right here was everyone's favorite storekeeper, Cy Lavatory. He was the one who had the deli down where now it's Lily's Deli. Well, it was Cy's Deli for a good portion of the 60s. And I'm not sure if the Lions were extant at that time, and that's who all these gentlemen are, but I do recognize Cy, and they're doing what the Lions always did, which was make food for the crowds. And it's obviously night. And then the fair ended with a square dance, and the square dance was called, at that point, Lois Keeler was still the librarian, and this square dance was called by her husband, Elisha Keeler, who was actually quite a famous square dance caller, not only locally, but he called one of the ballet from Aaron Copland's Hoedown for George Balanchine's troupe in the city. So that's how the night ended in 1961. I just had to show this. This is a poster from the library fair in 1978 that took place at John Jay High School, which was, at least, I don't know if it was the only time or one of two times the fair was at the high school. But looking at these hats, at this poster, the hats of the people who were involved in, some of them, the names are very familiar nowadays. We have Ann Testa up here. Unfortunately, we lost Barbara Mayer a couple of years ago. We've lost Anne Marie Tidaldi. Tina Cole's name, there's somebody named Maureen Koehl. Carol Dockery. Oh, this is Carol Dexter. Carol Dockery is someplace else. Betsy Barnett. Mimi Smith, who volunteered at the library for a long time. Libby Ferdinandson, who unfortunately we've lost. Catherine Wagner is in Florida, who was the technical and children's librarian for a long time. Peter and Betty Trez. We're going to see something more of Betty Trez in a minute. Oh, here's Carol Dockery up here. Okay, she did a lot of publicity. And then we have Helen Cloward. The chairman were Helen, Nancy Carl, and Donna Bates. But all of these names were so important to the library, and still are, some of them. This is a picture from 1985, and I chose this. Barbara Herzl and I ran the fair with Marie Putri back about 1981 or 82. But here are the ladies getting ready for Attic Treasures. And this is Marie Williams. And if any of you have worked the Attic Treasures anywhere in the last 10 years, Marie was still there. Her hair wasn't quite so dark, but that was her way of giving back, and her husband, Bob, for years and years and years. Then I don't know if we have Peter Rose in the audience, but if we do, she might recognize her daughter, Pamela. And these girls, Stephanie Glasser, Pamela, Kristen Johansson, and Chris Anderson, spent some afternoon in 1985 making all these cookies to sell at the bake sale. And I thought, well, if Peter signs on to this, she might get a kick out of seeing her daughter in 1985. This picture is from 1991, and we're at Onitrue. We've been at Onitrue for 10 years, and this looks like it was the flower booth, and which used to be very, very big, bigger than it probably is nowadays. But this is kind of what we look like at Onitrue. And we couldn't leave without taking a little bit, talking a little bit about the book sale and the pre-sale. This gentleman who I always think of as a dirty old man looking at books, but it points the way to another wonderful person who was a library supporter and a library volunteer. And this is Helen Wallace, who lived down in Truesdale until she moved out to California. But here she is at Onitrue in 1980. I think this is 1994, getting the books ready for the book sale. I mentioned Betty Trez. Betty Trez was a wonderful, she and Peter for years and years sold apples and cheese at the library fair. But one year in the early 80s, just after we moved to Onitrue, she and her daughters made 80 of these aprons, and a good number of them, some of them have gone by the wayside, but a good number of them are still being used down at Attic Treasures. And here's a couple of badges that volunteers wear when they're going around collecting money. And here's a poster that I just love. It was done for 1993, and it looks very much like the handiwork of my good friend Louisa Antonez. And this is when, for the couple of years, we started calling it a fair at the farm. So that's our, oh, not quite. Big thing at the fair is the pulling of the winning ticket. And here is Cindy Mahan, who chaired the fair very ably for several years. And here's the man who was our main announcer for I don't know how many years, John Stumpf, until he moved away. And there they are, picking the winning ticket. But we have to come up into the present age, and there's the rock star, John Rubino, who's been our favorite announcer for the last several years. And there he is. Looks like he's announcing the winners in the silent auction there. So there we come to our end of our little side trip into the library fair. Now we come back to the library, and I think this is why my daughter signed up to watch this. This is going back, this is 1972. This is the main circ desk. And this would have been, if you remember where the main door was, the front door facing the street, you would have come right across through the front room into this open area. And this was the circ desk. And this is my daughter, Sarah, who was volunteering at a very young age. I think she must be about 4 there, with Alethea Collin. This is when I started volunteering at the library. Alethea was the desk clerk. She taught me everything I needed to know about being a library volunteer. Her husband was the building inspector for a long time, and she also worked as Al Jordan's secretary. But at this point, she was helping us. She was working at the library. And there's Sarah. There's Sarah's jacket. But we're noticing the bell bottoms and the strange, in quotes, clothes that we all wore back in the 70s. But this is what the library looked like until, well, we didn't get to that slide yet. Oops, I dumped my patter. But this is 1965, when most people don't even remember. We had quite a large record collection, which was housed in the magazine room. which later became the magazine room. But here's the up-to-date technology, multimedia technology from 1965. One of the trustees, Jonathan Landman, when he passed away, he gave enough money to start this record collection. And you could take records out, you could take them out like books and bring them home. And they were all LPs, 33 1/3. But here we have an interesting little crew of people listening to records. And since you have to be quiet in the library, you listened with headphones. Now we're where I thought we were going to be. This is, and I think this is Martha Gordon, who was the children's librarian. If it's not Martha Gordon, it looks like Connie Miller, who was president of the board back at some point in the 70s. But she's showing what's going to happen. These are the George Van Gelderen plans for the library that was to be added on in 1974. Pointing to the skylight. And as Liz said, by the time we were ready to put up the new library, that skylight was no longer letting the skylight through. I'm not sure, these kids make me think they're the Van Marter, Jordy and Missy, but I'm not sure. And I think his name is Jason and he lived on Salem Hill, but I can't remember his name. Anyway, here's the library as we knew it until 2014. And here are the powers that be putting the cornerstone into place for that 1974 library. This is Supervisor Al Jordan. This is Michael Schaefer, the pastor of St. John's. This is Colleen Dewhurst, who was our mistress of ceremony for the dedication ceremony. And I believe this is Christopher Fuller, who led the campaign to raise money for it, and the Fullers had the most incredible lawn party at their house in Wacabuck to raise money for the new library. Now, another little segue, and then we'll be back to the rest of the library and how it has gotten to 2021. Here we have the Sun Trap before it became the Sun Trap. It was an ash tree that was taken down at the South Salem Presbyterian Church. And over here is Axel Horn and his friend Ivan Biro, both artists in their own right and sculptors. And they are deciding what is going to be done with this big ash log. Well, this was probably 1978 or 79. The log was carted down by the highway department, put out behind the library, and then it had to age, it had to dry, it had to season for a while. And then the artist would get to work. So it sat out here behind the library. It was a great magnet for children. Here are the four main men who were instrumental in actually getting the Sun Trap put in place and sculpted. This is Steve Lewis. He was our treasurer of the library for many, many, many years. Ed Kieran, who was highway superintendent. It was through Ed's auspices that the highway department was able to move the log and put the sculpture in place and do whatever needed to be done. This is Murray Melvin, who was an artist from Goldensburg. And here we have Axel Horn, who was the mastermind behind the project. And here we have Gil Nagle, who was my neighbor and a good friend, and unfortunately passed away about 20 years ago now, much, much too soon. But Gail spent hours and hours. She was an artist in her own right, and she spent many hours working on this sculpture and making the Sun Trap come alive. Here it is. It's been put in place. There's Steve again. And here we have Judith Israel, who was the director of the library. This is 1982. And this is Jody. And guess who? Dorothy Carr. Well, looks like Murray over here. But Dorothy was the technical services and yeah, I don't know if she was children's library. She was definitely technical services and reference, and Jody was director. And there they are looking at the rising of the Sun Trap. or the tuning fork, whichever you want to call it. And here it is in all its new glory. And you can see it was painted. It had, and this also up here, it's hard to see, but I believe this was also painted a blue. This was blue. And that's how it was for many years until, unfortunately, even with all the preservative that Axel and his workers put on it, the ash did rot, and it was recast in a resin. Axel was also well known as a WPA artist, and I just wanted to show one of his works of art. And it kind of brought to mind what we're all doing nowadays, is waiting in line for our vaccines. So this probably, it looks like 1940. I'm not sure. It might just be number 40 in all of his pictures, his catalog. But I think this was from a health clinic out in the Midwest. Here we are, getting into more recent history. Here's the picture of Dorothy in 1987 when she was appointed director of the library. And here is a picture of, oops, I wanted to just move it up, but of Dorothy when she at a retirement party at Le Chateau in 2003. And I don't think she looked any different. Maybe there's a little gray hair showing here, but Dorothy, the library did not age you one bit. We had, as Liz mentioned, my husband and I and Jean and Paul Lewis ran a folk concert series for about 20 years at the library. And this is one of our favorite performers, Bill Staines. And this background, which I realized when, again, Liz and I were doing our warm-up earlier this week, that this background that we use for all of our folk concerts was made by that little girl you saw at the counter with Alethea. My daughter, Sarah, when she was in high school or early college, made a background for our folk concert series, which started in 1983 and ended around 2003 or a little later. But Sarah batik this backdrop for our folk concert series. Here we are. We're finally coming of age. We're coming to our final iteration. And here we have a lot of happy faces ready to start digging for the newest iteration of the library. And this was April 2nd, 2014. We have Gary Page, Sans Hirsuteness, Monty Gerbush, who unfortunately passed away at too early an age, but Rose Bonanno, if you're watching, there's Monty. Lisa Wickersham, Mary Shaw, Karen Potes hiding behind her, a jolly Cindy Rubino, our librarian at the time, Renee, whose last name I just went totally out of my mind, who was one of the architects, and Ken Klotzman, treasurer, former trustee Peggy Pryor, and Tina Coles, Teresa Eker, Shannon Robinette, who unfortunately we've lost, myself, Nancy Ferguson, one of the jolliest trustees we ever had, Ruth Osher, and the supervisor, Peter Parsons. And so that was a happy day in 2014. The next happy day was in 2015 when all the books that had been moved down to our temporary home at the South Salem Presbyterian Church are on their way, book by book, back up to the library. This was ceremonial. Most of the books came by car and truck. But here we have Susan Hamilton. There's a great picture of Susan Hamilton, who was our everything person for many years at the library, our desk clerk, and then she became the assistant in everything possible. Here's the book line, and here we have good old Liz. Liz is our ombudsman. Liz has actually, she told me, been almost the second oldest, not oldest, the second longest library employee from 2002 when Dorothy took over. Uh, Still going strong today. The only person, and I don't have a picture of this person, the only person who has served the library longer as a volunteer and an employee is Millie Huffmeyer. And I don't know if Millie is signed on today or not, but we want to send kudos to Millie. I know Millie was there in the 70s when my children and I came to, when I volunteered and my children came to Story Hour. So congrats, Millie. I don't know how many years, but I think you need a watch. Here we are in the happy 2015, and we have Cindy cutting the ribbon with a small scissors, and Adam Rose and Michael McQuillan, they gave the big bucks, so they've got the big scissors. And we have the town councilman, Dan Welsh, Peter, supervisor, Peter Parsons. I think this is Dave Buchwald, and I don't know who that is, but here we are happily cutting the ribbon of our new library. Here's what it looks like inside, at least what it looked like in 2019 when we could still do things, to have a volunteer fair. And here is the garden club actually are the ones basically in this picture. But that's what the library is all about, the heart of the town, the heart of the community, and just open to all sorts of things, including the jazz concerts, which have taken over for the folk concerts. And here is Steve Shapiro, who kind of got them started with his vibraphone and his, he has so many friends in the jazz business that he kind of started us off on the right foot. And so that's the music that's happening at the library. Maybe when we get back, hopefully in a not too long a future time, more concerts. Here is Anna Moser, who is our fantastic children's librarian who came up with more things to do than anybody on this earth. And whether she's pointing at the stars or pointing at her trip out to the Midwest, where she's now ensconced in Springfield, Illinois, I don't know, but we miss you, Anna, but we welcome our new children's librarian, Marie. So we'll see what goes. But there's a nice picture of Anna. And where would we be without our teen librarian, Dolores Antonez? And here she is in what she likes to do best is, well, probably likes to do best is hike. But when she can hike with the teenagers, that's second best. And this is from one of their hikes. So we salute you, Dolores, because you're my buddy in crime when we do anything theatrical at the library. So we welcome Jane to take your spot, but we sure do miss you. Well, sad to say, this is what the library has looked like, well, what it looked like in a good part of the summer months for 2020 until the storm came along and blew the tent down. But this was our curbside pickup tent for the library, the Lewisboro Library in 2020. And here's kind of the library sign that we unfortunately have gotten to know too well. Here is just a small kind of putting together maybe a summary of things for the library. Started out as the Salem Library, went to the South Salem Library, and then I believe I saw it was 2008. Since I still want it to be the South Salem Library, I kind of put in the back of my mind how it became the Lewisboro Library. However, in something I saw, and maybe on the Q&As, Cindy can pipe up and tell us, but something I saw said 2008, we segued to the new name for the new library. Here were the early librarians: Aaron Keeler, Stephen Gilbert, Reuben Frame, who also happened to be the rector or the pastor of the Presbyterian Church. So he was being librarian and pastor at the same time. Joseph Webster, who wrote that little history. Sidney Lockwood, well, no, that was his father, and this was the one who wrote the history. And then Cyrus Fancher served as the first librarian when they moved to the meeting house. And luckily, I don't know if I mentioned, during this, at the Civil War time, when the library kind of fell on bad times, anybody who wanted to took the books home. Cyrus Fancher took a lot of the books home. And so when he became librarian after the move to the new quarters, he brought a lot of those books back. And Theodore Van Norden and James Crafts, who was the builder of what we know as the Black Mansion, they were both very instrumental in starting up the new library in 1897. And those two men donated many books to the new library. All these from the 1950s were just volunteers. Marilyn Cressy was the first paid librarian from 1950 to 63, and Lois Keeler. And then after Lois left, there were 3 librarians in here until Beth Walker started. Then we had Nancy Jackson, who I always think of as great for craft projects. She was especially good on tie dyeing. Then we had Judith Israel, Maria Breck, and there was maybe somebody else, and then Mary Lee Fogelsong, who came to us from Philadelphia, and she was awesome. I was president when Mary Lee came, and it was through Mary Lee's encouragement that finally got the Board of Trustees to agree to include computers in the library's necessary equipment. So it was Mary Lee who got us involved in that. And then unfortunately, Mary Lee was headhunted to become head of adolescent services at the New York Public Library. And so she had to go off to take a job that nobody could refuse. But instead of Mary Lee, we got Dorothy Carr, who saw us through a lot of growth and led the way to Cindy Rubino, who is the one we all know and love today, keeping us in touch with reality. Just for fun, the salaries, 1945, $100, book budget, $95.96. Next year, librarian didn't get a raise, but certainly the books budget got a 400 times increase. 1955, finally, librarian got a $300 raise. And the books only went up a little bit. 1960, wow, look at this. In 5 years, they finally realized they should pay the librarian a little bit more. Actually, to think about it, back here, the library wasn't open 5 days a week. It was probably open maybe 6 hours a week. 1960 saw this increase. 1966 with Beth Walker coming and taking on a lot more responsibility and probably a lot more time of the library being open. Big budget jump in books and definitely in the salary. We're not going to ask Cindy how much she makes a day, but it's certainly a little bit larger than what Beth made in 1966. Here are the sources I used, and we're coming to the end, so get your questions ready. A library, we were going to end with this. A library is a hospital for the mind, which was an anonymous saying that somebody found online, and Cindy said along to me, or Liz, as something we could just use as a nice placeholder. But then today I was walking my dog, and my husband and I were walking down to the library, and this is what the library looks like today. If you look closely, the dog and husband are up here. But yesterday, I guess it was Jane. I think it was the teenage librarian, whatever. These were supposed to be space aliens, and the front lawn is definitely been visited by creatures from outer space. I think we're going to leave it there until I can escape from this, and give it back to Liz if there are any questions. And
thank you so much, Maureen. That was wonderful presentation.